Right, hello folks. So this video is just going to cover the basics of drum racks in Ableton Live. So let's load one in. This is just the default drum rack. When you drag it in, it has nothing in it. So these are referred to as pads, these things that say C1, C#1, D1, etc. These are drum rack pads. And into these pads we can put a variety of things. I'm going to start off by putting a kick sample in, if I can spell kick correctly. That one will do, it doesn't really matter what I'm going to work with. So we can launch it by pressing this play button here, or we can also launch it by pressing the corresponding MIDI value. So if you look there, I'm triggering C2. So if I trigger C1, I'll trigger the sound of the kick. So now I'm going to put a snare sound in. There we go, I'll just drag that in. So now if I trigger C#1, I hear the sample that's on C#1. Okay, I'm just going to open out this chain list. So this is the chain list here. Each chain has its own name, and it will take the name from the pad. So if we rename this kick, now the chain's called kick, and if we rename this pad snare, now the chain's called snare, we can right click and give it a different color. And also what we've got within the chain list is a mixer. So this is the chain mixer. So we've got a little play icon which shows you when the sample's being played. This is a Midi meter which shows you when Midi is passing through. We've got volume, panning for spatialization. This is an activator button which turns it on and off. The corresponding mute button works with that as well. So if we mute the pad here, this track activator goes off. If we turn the track activator off here, the mute button goes on here. And we can also solo, and we can hot swap. So hot swap is where you can select another sound. So for example that one, hit enter, and it'll automatically swap the sample in, like so. And then we can press close up here to come out of hot swap mode. Alright, so in terms of signal flow in a drum rack, obviously we have MIDI information coming in here. If I use my keyboard here, you can see the MIDI information registering on the MIDI meter here. The MIDI information coming into the drum rack and triggering whichever pad corresponds with the MIDI note, and then the sample which lives on that pad being triggered, and then we've got audio coming out here. So this is an audio meter. If we add an effect, let's say overdrive. If we put an overdrive in there, and we'll just make this quite extreme so we can hear it. There we go. So we're hearing overdrive on the kick there, and if I trigger the snare, we're hearing overdrive on the snare as well. That's because this audio effect lives outside of the drum rack. So this curved edge here is where the drum rack ends. The audio meter here is the audio meter, the signal running between the drum rack and this effect, and then we've got the audio meter coming out of the effect here. However, if I move this overdrive and I put it directly onto the chain, if you notice the curved edge of the drum rack is now after the overdrive, and if I select the snare chain, the overdrive disappears. That's because now the effect lives on the kick chain, and we have overdrive on the kick, but not on the snare. Okay, so that's an important one to bear in mind when you're placing effects. There's a few different ways of placing effects on chains. You can drag them directly to the pad. That'll put them on the chain. You can drag them directly onto the chain. That will put them on the chain. You can drag them directly into the chain. And if you want to do that, you have to make sure you put them inside the drum rack there. Or finally, you could put them outside the drum rack, like I did in the first instance, like so. And then we get the effect happening to everything that comes out of the drum rack. Okay, so that's signal flow. We can also put MIDI effects into a drum rack. So if I take this arpeggiator and drop it onto the kick chain, we have an arpeggiator prior to the sampler here. So if I trigger the kick, So the MIDI notes going into the sampler to trigger the sample are subject to any MIDI effects that you place prior to it. I'll just get rid of that. MIDI effects do have to go prior to the sampler. It won't let you put a MIDI effect afterwards. Here, maybe you get a little warning, because after the sampler, the signal has been converted to audio. It's no longer a MIDI signal. Okay, I'm just going to say a little bit more about the chain mixer because I don't think that I showed. I kind of glossed that over that before, didn't I? So we'll just trigger this. So I can bring the volume of things up and down. I can double click to put them back to default. I can pan things left and right. I can solo things. Yeah. So you've got a little basic mixer there, which is nice. Okay, however, the mixer can get a little bit more complex. It's got a send and return setup in it. So we can use this for audio effects. So let's go with our overdrive again. I'll just drop the overdrive in there, click on the overdrive and turn the dry wet control up to 100%. So now we've got a send and return setup. Until you put an effect in the return area here, this little send button will be grayed out. But once you do put an effect in here, it's no longer grayed out. We can select it. And when you select it, you get the option to send signal from any of your chains to any of the destinations in the return area here. So we can now send signal from either our kick or our snare or both to the overdrive. Okay, and we've also got the same mixer controls in the return area that we have in the normal chain list. So we've got volume, panning, activator, solo, so on and so forth. So that's quite nice. So I've deleted that now, so this send is now grayed out. We can't bring up the sends unless we've got something here. We can also hide the return area by pressing that R button again. Okay, I want to draw your attention also to this receive option. You only see it if you select the I/O, which stands for input output button here at the bottom left. So by default, the receive MIDI note here will map to the MIDI note that corresponds with the pad that the sample is on. So I drop the kick onto the C1 pad. When I press C1, the kick is triggered. And so this is by default is on C1. Okay, if I change that to be anything other than C1, I'm now pressing C1, and notice it's actually moved the pad as well. So if I drag down here, it hasn't moved the pad, it's moved the sample to another different pad. So if I change this back to C1, it's moved it back again. Okay, and it would be the same with the snare. The reason I bring this up is because it's going to be important for the next part. We can change this to all notes. So now the kick is triggered by every single note that I play, and you can hear there that the pitch changes. Based on the pitch of the incoming MIDI note. Okay, so that's the receive setting. And when we get to using a drum rack for additive synthesis, that's going to be an important feature for us to use. For now, I'll just change this back to, what was it? It was C1. Okay, I think that's mostly everything covered, but the last thing I want to draw your attention to, actually, let's talk about something fundamental before we go. The fundamental act of bringing in a sample to a drum rack, like so. What Live actually does is it places that sample inside this device, which is called a simpler, and then the simpler lives on the pad. So we've got the overall drum rack, we've got the drum rack pads, which are these things, and then we've got a simpler device which houses the sample, which lives on the pad. That's quite a fundamental thing that I forgot to cover before. I'm not going to go into the ins and outs of a simpler device. That would be for a later video. Okay, and one other thing just to mention, which is going to be important later as well, you don't just have to drag samples into pads, you can drag devices onto pads. So say, for example, an analog device can live on a pad as well. and we could say that we want that analog to react to all notes. So we're playing an analog there as part of a drum rack. Some of you might be thinking, what's the point of that? We'll get to that in the next part for additive synthesis. So these are the macro controls. We've looked at macro controls with other devices, such as instrument racks. So I'm not going to go into them now. This is to show and hide the chain list that we've talked about. This is to show and hide the device which lives on the chain. So you can do that just to free up a little bit of space. We've covered I/O, send and return. And the last thing that I haven't covered, I'm just going to get rid of analog just so this isn't confused, is this auto select setting, which is very handy. You have to have the device view open to notice the difference here. So if I turn this off and I trigger the kick, I thought I was triggering the kick, I need to change. Come on, there we go. If I trigger the kick and then I trigger the snare, yeah, nothing changes over here. If I turn on auto select and then trigger the kick and then the snare, see that this changes over here, and the selection here is based on the last note that you triggered. So I trigger the kick, it selects that chain and it shows the device over here. I trigger the snare, it selects that chain and it shows the device over here. Trigger the other snare, it selects that chain and it shows that the corresponding device over there. That's the drum rack.